So in this lesson, we're going to be looking at Dynamesh. Dynamesh allows you to sculpt characters in ZBrush completely independently of any sort of internal volume of the original model you import. Now what that means is, in previous lessons, we've imported meshes from outside of ZBrush. We've even used the default polysphere inside of ZBrush to create characters. And in both of those cases, we are using the volume of that model to generate our piece. Now, if you were to import a generic human mesh, a biped, and then need to drag a tail and wings off of it, you would find yourself in a situation where you were pushing the limits of that volume really far, trying to stretch those shapes out from the base mesh. Dynamesh allows you to dynamically remesh as you sculpt. So what that means is, in this character here, I started with spheres. I started pushing and pulling and adding arms and legs and head, dynameshing as I go. So the ZBrush will dynamically update the underlying topology to support the volume that I'm trying to make. So it's an extremely powerful way of generating your volumes for your character. So let's take a look at what that means just using a polysphere again. If we open up a polysphere, go to the geometry menu, you see the polysphere has 3 subdivisions by default. Dynamesh does not allow subdivision levels. You should never be dividing a Dynamesh, and if you try and Dynamesh a model that has subdivision levels, it will force you to delete them. So I'm just going to delete the lower levels, then go to the Dynamesh menu here. There is a resolution slider. I'm going to set this to about, let's say, 40. And I'm going to press Dynamesh. I'm going to go into frame mode so you can see what happens. When I press Dynamesh, it dynamically remeshes the model into an evenly distributed all-quad format. Now, I'm going to turn on my X symmetry, use my move brush, and I'm just going to start shaping the sphere into a creature head, just like we usually do. Just create those egg shapes, create a cranial mass, facial mass, start stretching this down. In this case, I'm going to mask out the back of the head here, invert the mask, and I'm just going to pull a big shape off the back of the head. My purpose here is I'm really trying to push the limits of the volume that I'm working with. Let's create some eye sockets here. Use the clay tubes brush to build up a mouth, some cheekbones. There we go. So you see we're really pushing the limits of that sphere. Now because we're a Dynamesh, if I control, click, and drag on the background, you see what just happened. It dynamically remeshed the model. So I can continue to work on it, just using my clay tubes brush, just building up the nose bridge here. Let's create just sort of an interesting character here. I'm going to move those eye sockets up a bit higher. I'm actually going to spread them out to the sides a bit here. There we go. Make some nostrils here, some nasal structures. Now we're working with a relatively low resolution Dynamesh, so we're not going to get a bunch of detail. We can increase our Dynamesh resolution later, but when I'm starting out, I try and be very careful not to have a whole lot of detail in my Dynamesh. Dynameshing for me isn't about sculpting detail. It's really about creating the basic volumes that I will use to sculpt my character. So let's go ahead and I'm actually going to do a multiple sort of eye on this creature here, so I'm going to make multiple sockets for it. There we go. Okay, so go into frame mode, control, click, and drag, Dynameshes. Now you don't have to be in frame mode to Dynamesh your model. I just do it so you can see what happens. I'm going to go ahead and save my work here really quick. Now, Dynamesh allows us to really push and pull shapes here. I'm going to go ahead and mask out where I want my neck to come off this model. Invert that mask, and now I will just take the move brush and stretch that neck out, just like so. Use the move brush to pull down a chest, pull out the shoulders. And you can see this really is stretching the limits of that model. Now if I execute my Dynamesh, I'll control, click, and drag once, and that just clears the mask. It doesn't do a Dynamesh. If I control, click, and drag again, now the Dynamesh has been executed. So now I can come in here and start to sculpt some neck shapes, some clavicles, some back muscles here, the trapezius, deltoids. So you can see basically we are just building volume as we need it. And then ZBrush dynamically remeshes and takes care of it from there. So I'm going to go ahead and create some more forms in the back of the head here. I want to sort of offset these, make kind of a segmented insectoid look here. It looks like we're going for some kind of an insect or crustacean style alien. So you can see this lets me just really go all out and start stretching these forms. Clear the mask, execute Dynamesh. You see how easy that is, how really simple it is to just go ahead and create the shapes that you want. Stretch that out. Let's bring those out to the side so we can actually see them from the front. Execute Dynamesh. There we go. Now let's say that there's pieces that we want to get rid of. Let's say that I don't want this piece that I just put on the back. What I can do is I can use my visibility controls. That's Control Shift Click and Drag. Now you remember the default for this is actually the selection rectangle. Selection rectangle here. That creates this green rectangle. If I hold down the Alt key, it hides what's inside of it. If I go to the brush menu, I can change it to Select Lasso. Click OK, and that will allow me this lasso control, which is far more precise. I can delete the back of the head like that, go to Geometry, Modify Topology, Delete Hidden. Those faces are now deleted, so when I Control Click and Drag, it will Dynamesh and fill the hole. So now we can go in here and build that up again. Now we're also able to use things like the snake hook brush, B for brush, S for snake, H for hook. This allows us to pull these really nice little tendrils off the model if I want to make these little spiky bits here. That's no problem. We just start pulling these spikes off. And you see what happens is they look a little bit stretched on their tips, but as soon as I Dynamesh, they look just fine. There we are. So, in addition to being able to push and pull and stretch the mesh like this, there's also other tools that we can use, specific brushes that really lend themselves to Dynamesh. One of those are the Insert Mesh brushes. So I'm going to go ahead and save my work here. And we'll take a look at the Insert Mesh brushes. You pull up the Insert Mesh brushes by pressing B for brush, I for insert, and that's going to show you all of your Insert Mesh brushes here. So we're going to start with the simpler ones. There's many here called IMM. That inserts multiple meshes. It stands for Insert Multiple Mesh, whereas we're going to use the basic ones here like Insert Cube or Insert Sphere, which just inserts a single object. Now, the insert brushes don't have to only be used on Dynameshes. The only rule is they must be used on meshes that only have one subdivision level. So I'm going to select Insert Sphere, and watch this. If I click and drag inside the eye, it inserts a sphere there. Now, it masks the rest of the head. Now, this is not a subtool. It's actually inserting it into that Z tool right there. So I can use the transpose line now if I want to move my eye into the head. If I want to scale it or rotate it. I could also invert the mask and now use the move brush to work the shapes of the eye around that sphere that we're inserting. So I can bring those cheekbones out a bit. I can bring the brow forms out. Maybe I want to give a little bit more sort of character to that eye. There we go. Control, click, and drag once clears the mask. Control, click, and drag a second time executes the Dynamesh. Now it's a little bit soft in the edge there, but that's just because we've got a lower Dynamesh resolution. If I go back to Geometry, Dynamesh, you see that we're still at 40. If I wanted that to be higher, I could raise this. In this case, we can set it to 80. Just touch the model so it registers it has a new resolution. Now execute Dynamesh, and you see it's a much sharper look, but it's also a denser mesh. So let's insert a few more spheres here. I'll just go back to Insert Sphere, and let's insert some eye spheres in these little sockets that we made. There we go. That's pretty creepy. We could do a few right here as well. And then execute our Dynamesh, and that glues those pieces in. You'll also see that those insert meshes have their own polygroup, which makes it quite easy to work around them. So I can isolate and mask those eyes, and then I can use the Move brush to continue shaping the sockets around them. Again, don't get too caught up in your details when you're Dynameshing. The most important thing with Dynamesh is getting your volumes. I really think it's the most powerful as a tool for generating your basic forms, and then going in using your standard subdivision modeling to create all your details. And I'll be showing you in a later lesson how you can actually bounce back and forth between Dynamesh and subdivision modeling. It's quite simple. I've got a really nice process that I've devised for doing that helps me a lot in my day-to-day work. I'm constantly bouncing back and forth between Dynamesh and subdivision modeling. I personally can't live without having subdivision levels because, well, you'll see why. Just creating a little bit more detail there, executing my Dynamesh. The first Control, click, and drag clears the mask. The next one executes Dynamesh. And that's taking an awful long time. Probably want to edit that out. The ZBrush beta is very unstable. This is very unstable. There we go. Okay, so you probably want to cut this portion out, and coming back now. Now that we've seen how to use our basic insert brushes, let's look at something a little bit more complicated. Let's do B for brush, I for insert. And let's take a look at Insert Multi-Mesh. Many of these are more hard surface pieces like clothing parts or gun parts or industrial parts, but some of them serve particularly well in organic models like IMM Toon for cartoon model pieces, and then IMMB parts. So if I select IMMB parts, this is Insert Multi-Mesh Body Parts. If I press the M key, it'll bring up the meshes that can be inserted. So anytime you're using an IMM brush, the M hotkey shows you the meshes that brush can insert. So I'll start with a torso. Let's go to the center line of the model, click and drag, and that draws a torso. But obviously we need to move it into position, so we use the Transpose Move brush. Rotate and scale it just to get that torso into position. I'll use the Move brush to shift these pieces out. And I can invert the mask, just like we do in our others, and just make sure the blend is how I want it, and then execute Dynamesh, and you see that those two pieces have now glued together. And they are polygrouped separately. So let's insert some arms now. I'll do B for brush, I for insert, go back to body parts, then press M, and you see we've got an arm here. Select the arm, and I will draw it roughly where I want it to go, but obviously it needs to be moved into position. So I will transpose rotate it, I will transpose move it, and I want it to actually be rotated around its axis here. So I'm going to click and the center circle of my rotate, and that will rotate it around the center axis. And now we can move these into position. Let's move this back here, like so. And we'll rotate them out a bit. There we are. So obviously I think I need to scale these arms up, so I'm just going to go ahead and do a quick scale of them. Now when I'm working on like creature arms, I'll often want them to be a bit longer in proportion, so I'll just draw a transpose line down to the elbow. Make sure I'm in move mode and just Alt click and drag the outer circle, and that just lets me stretch that joint. So now it's a lot more creepy, creature-like arm. I'll invert my mask now, and I'll use the move brush just to make sure the torso and the arms meet up more or less. Dynamesh will bridge the gap, so if it doesn't match up perfectly, it's actually quite fine. I'll invert the mask again, and I'm going to go ahead and just start sculpting in some clavicles here, or some scapulas, just starting to think about how these bits interrelate to each other before we even Dynamesh them together. It can be a bit nice just to have those parts already in position. Do some smoothing, clear the mask, execute Dynamesh, and there we go. Then we can just use Smooth Brush to knock back the faceting that was baked into the arms there. So it's quite powerful. As you can see, you can build up a model, build up a body from nothing, just from the bare bones. Individual pieces using the body parts here in ZBrush. So let's go ahead and mask this head out a bit. Oops. I actually want to lengthen the neck. So I'm going to go ahead and mask out the head and neck. And I'm just going to use transpose move, just to sort of stretch that neck a little bit. I feel like the neck's a bit short. There we go. And execute Dynamesh. Now, a lot of times people ask me, how can you cut negative spaces in your model? Because ZBrush has always been really easy for creating new volumes, but when you want to actually cut a hole in something, it's been a bit of an Achilles heel in ZBrush. It's been real difficult to go in and just knock a hole in something. And when I'm sculpting in clay, I will often I'll take advantage of negative spaces. I like cutting holes in the model, and that's real difficult to do in ZBrush until now. If I wanted to cut a negative space in something, like maybe I want to scallop a shape out here, I'll go back to my insert brushes and I'll select any one of them, like Insert Sphere. Now remember, when you're holding down the Alt key, you're subtracting. So if I hold down Alt, click and drag, it creates this sphere, but when I let go, it has negative space. You see it's flipped. The normals are flipped. So that's a visual cue to let me know that when I execute that Dynamesh, it's going to carve that volume out. So you see that just let me carve that shape right out there. So if I do it again here, holding down the Alt key, just like so, execute Dynamesh, it carves that shape out. You see we've just cut a hole right inside the top of the head. So let's do another one. There you see those tubes are really long going through that head. Execute Dynamesh, and there we go. So it's very, very easy now to cut negative spaces and things. And that, if you're brand new to ZBrush, you might not know it, but that actually used to be very, very tricky. And now it's just a walk in the park. I'm going to mask out these crests on the head here and just try and use transpose rotate to rotate those out just a bit. There we go. Now if I want to delete something, remember, I Control Shift, click and drag, and I can just cut something away just like that. Go to Modified Topology, Delete Hidden, and then Dynamesh to patch the holes. Now I can use that Insert Sphere in another way. I can come here to the chest, and I can use this to create pectoralis muscles. So I'll just draw two spheres there. And this is really similar to écorché sculpture. I don't know if any of you have experimented with écorché, but it's a great method for learning anatomy. I did it few times. I did it when I was in college. I believe John Brown teaches an écrochet class in his sculpting classes at Noman. I learned écrochet at the Savannah College of Art and Design. We had a fantastic écrochet program. In most places, you'll find some art school that will teach some form of écrochet. And what it basically is just taking a skeleton model and then laying out tubes of clay in the form of the muscles. That's all it is. So I can use the pectoralis, or use the sphere here to sort of do an écrochet and sort of sculpt in a pectoralis muscle. Execute my Dynamesh, and then just smooth that back, and it gives me the base form of my pectoralis muscle there. I can start to build up the clavicle, build up the deltoid a bit. There's been figures that I built up entirely just using spheres in an écrochet manner here inside of ZBrush. So being able to build things up with their basic forms like that is actually quite powerful. Come back to the back here, we can build up the trapezius and the latissimus dorsi muscles here. So let's take a look at some other brushes that we can use to insert shapes into our model that are not listed under the Insert Mesh brushes. These will be curve brushes. So I'm going to go ahead and save my work. Always save your work often. It's just a good habit to get into when you're working in any program. So if we go to the brush menu and press C for curve, there's a brush here called Curve Tube. If I select that, then go to my stroke menu and tear my stroke menu off to dock it on the right side of the screen, you see we've got a curve mode here, right there under the curve menu. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use this to create some tubes. So I'm going to click and drag, and it draws a tube. Now by default, it's not going to have this taper to it. By default, yours will look like that. So what this tube is, it's basically a tube being extruded down this curve. I'm going to draw another one here so we can see it a lot more clearly. There we go. See, there's this red and black dotted line and two white circles. Now those white circles are the end points, and the dotted line is the curve. You'll notice that my brush is blue as I'm going down the length of the curve. That means that I'm in curve edit mode. I'm able to just go in here and change the shape of the curve. If I move off the curve, my brush becomes red. If I change my draw size and now click the curve, it will change the diameter of the tube. If I go to the curve menu here, you see that I've got lock, start, and end. So if I click lock, start, this is my start point. I can position it anywhere I want, like let's position it right here where I've got that little socket for the tentacles. Now I can grab the end point and move it wherever I want. And you see that the tube stays anchored at the start point. It's actually really, really useful. I'm going to change my draw size. I'm just going to turn it up a little bit, just to make that curve line up a little bit better with the socket I've made for it. Now I'm going to come down here to curve modifiers under the stroke menu, and I'm going to turn on size. You might find that your curve by default looks like this, going from small to big. If that's the case, just flip it vertically so it goes from big to small, and then click on the curve, and look what happens. It turns it into a really nice tapering tentacle. Look at that. Now if I want to execute that, I just Alt-click off that curve somewhere on the model. The curve disappears, and now that becomes geometry. I can now use my standard sculpting brushes to work on this. I'll use the inflate brush just to increase the base a little bit, get it positioned. Now when I'm happy with it, I Control, click, and drag twice, and that Dynameshes those tubes into my model. I can take away some of the faceting just by smoothing it. Look at that. So let's do that again. We'll draw another one. I'm going to go ahead and go to B for brush, C for curve, and select the curve tube. I'm going to draw my curve. Now I don't like how small it is, so I'll turn up my draw size and I'll click the curve again. Now my start point is automatically locked, so I'll go ahead and leave that start point locked, and I'm just going to try and pose this curve. Just like this. Now let's say it's too short. If I want to extend my curve, I just mouse towards the end, and you see I get that little red line that magnets to the end. That means if I click and drag, I can continue my curve from that point. There you go. You see I can extend that curve. Come up here, I can even do it on the inside. So I can then bring the start point back where I want it to be. And then bring the end point in. Alt-click on the model. Then we can do a little bit more work with the move brushes or any other sculpting tools. We want to change those a bit. Sometimes I like to actually make them a little bit asymmetrical at this point if I can. So I'll turn off my symmetry and then, mask one and then move the other just a little bit, because symmetrical tentacles are quite eye-catching. When I'm happy with it, I clear the mask and then execute Dynamesh. I'm just going to use my clay tubes brush to build up a few little points of attachment here for these tentacles. You can even make little sockets if you want, just like this, and they'll line up just fine. There we go. Now I'll go to B for brush, C for curve, and grab that curve tube. Go ahead and draw it, position it, and then just bring that end point down. Remember to change your draw size and then increase it until it fits nicely. It doesn't have to be perfect because you can change the sizing again once you've left the curve mode. So if I leave curve mode, I can then use inflate just to inflate the base so it lines up nicely with the socket. Now you'll see I accidentally had my X symmetry turned off there, so I'm going to redraw that. If you turn off your symmetry, it's important to remember that you have turned it off, which actually is a good point. If I zoom in here, and I can't see both sides of my model, and I want to know if I have X symmetry turned on, if I press the X key, look what happens to the outermost circle of my brush. You see how it's a double red circle? With X symmetry turned off, that circle, the outermost circle there, is a single line. If X symmetry is on, it's a double line. So that's just a really helpful visual cue to know when you've got your X symmetry turned on when you can't see both sides of your model. So let's go ahead and draw that tube again. It's kind of interesting. It looks like tusks, but I'm going to bring that down. Bring it over here. I'm going to draw a little extension there. There we go. Now let's position this where we want it. Just like this. I'm going to increase my draw size just to increase the size of the tentacle. Alt-click off the model, and then I'll just use inflate just to build it up a little bit. And then Control-click and drag twice to execute my Dynamesh. Now, if you want to draw tentacles that are laying against the surface, you can do that. Just go back to your curve brush, and under the curve menu, you see there is a snap function. If I click snap, my curve will snap to the surface of the model. You see it sticks to it. It's actually quite useful. So if I were to start here and then draw a tentacle, I can draw a real nice tentacle that sort of snaps to the underlying surface here. So let's let this one flow out a little bit like that. And let's actually change the draw size, shrink that down a bit, and I'll click on it. Now, this is an interesting tool here. If you draw your tube, position it, and then you like it and you want to make another one, you can just do this. If you go to Curve Functions, there is Snapshot. If I click Snapshot, what it's done now is it's snapshotted a copy of that geometry there. So I can now take my curve, which I'm happy with, and I can move it into another position. Maybe I want to move it back here. snapshot it, and then I can come over and make another one. So it's a really, really convenient way of just using the same curve multiple times. If I go back to curve and turn off snap, I'll be able to countersink that endpoint inside the head again so it doesn't get stuck to the surface. Now I'll click off the model. There's all of my tentacles, and I'll just control, click, and drag twice to Dynamesh them. We can come through here with the smooth brush and take away any faceting just with a quick run of the smooth brush, and then do some sculpting of detail if we like. Again, I really do think that the Dynamesh mode is not the best place to be doing detail. I do try and put a little bit in here, but not too much. Don't get stuck on it. Now, a lot of times people want to know how to make their own insert brushes. We will talk about that in a later lesson. I will show you how to make your own insert brushes, your own curve brushes as well, and how to make your own insert multi-mesh brushes. But those are going to take place in a later lesson, which deals just with brushes. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and check out that lesson. But for right now, we're just going to look at how to use these brushes in conjunction with Dynamesh. So in this lesson, we've seen how powerful Dynamesh is, allowing us to take a very basic volume, push and pull, and then insert mesh our way towards a completed figure. It's one of the most amazing modeling tools I've seen in a long time, but it also has its limitations. Like I've been saying, I don't think that you should treat Dynamesh as something you want to put lots of detail into. I take Dynamesh to about the point you see here. I get my volumes, I get my proportions, I get my gesture, I get my figure ready. Then I like to turn it into a standard subdivision model and then continue working from there. One of the most obvious reasons why you'd want to do that is that when you see how dense this model is, it's actually extremely difficult if you wanted to come in here and pose this using transpose posing. It's very, very difficult because you end up with really hard lines in your pose. It's also really difficult to get a nice blend in things because you're working with so much geometry. It just creates a real hard line at the bend. So here, if I draw a transpose line, it just creates a real hard edge. What I want to be able to do is step down to a lower subdivision level, do my pose changes, and then step back up. I feel like you're always going to be in a better situation if you're able to move between subdivision levels while you're working. It just gives you a whole lot more freedom and control than you're going to get when you're stuck in a single subdivision level sculpting the way you are in Dynamesh. So Dynamesh is extremely powerful. It's allowed us to do some amazing things, but we do need to be aware of its limitations. And I think the best way to use it is to bounce back and forth between a Dynamesh and a subdivision model. So how do we do that? This is the process that I've come up with to migrate from Dynamesh to subdivision model without losing any of our detail. What I'll do is I go to my subtool menu and I will duplicate my model. I will turn off the visibility on the original, so we're just looking at our duplicate. I'm going to remesh this into a low-res model by going to Geometry, ZRemesher. Now we have a whole lesson just on ZRemesher, so I'm only going to give you the basic information here. I'm going to set the target polygon count to about 1.5 thousand polygons, and then I will click ZRemesher, and that will automatically remesh the model. ZRemesher is an extremely powerful tool. It creates very competent, very, very good low-res base meshes that follow the forms of your high-res model. It's absolutely an incredible piece of work. So once this finishes completing, once it finishes calculating, you see it's doing a status line up there at the top of the screen. We will have a low-res version of our model. Here we go. Look at that. It's really well built, low-res model. We've got all our tentacles there. We've got our negative spaces there, edge loops around them. We even have edge loops cut around the eye. Really, really nice stuff here. So what I want to do is I want to be able to use this low res to pose my model, but I also want to have all my detail intact. So I'm going to divide this model twice. I will go back to my subtool menu and I'm going to turn on visibility of the high res. I'm going to project the low res onto the high res by going to Subtool, Project, and clicking Project All, and that shrink wraps my current model that's selected, the low res, onto the high res. So if I turn off the high res, you can see that's my low res that has now been shrink wrapped. I can step down and up my subdivision levels. So I'll Control D to divide one more time, and let's project one more time. And there we go. I'll turn off visibility on the high res again, and there's our low res, all of our detail intact. There might be a couple spots where we need to do a little bit of resculpting, but that's not usually an issue. I can add a subdivision level, pop right in there with my clay tubes, and just keep sculpting. Here there's an area that's a little bit off. I can easily go in with my clay tubes brush and repair that. So now I'm working on a regular old subdivision model where I can be sculpting at my high-res resolution, putting all my details in, just like this. Then if I decide I want to do some bigger form changes, all I need to do is step down my subdivision levels to a low resolution. I can come in now with my move brush and make big form changes just like this. Step back up, and the changes telegraph back up. If I step down my subdivision levels, I can now easily use my transpose tools to pose the model. If I wanted to pose the arms, for example, I can now easily pose the arms. Oops. Got a little bit of a rogue mask there. We can turn those arms down. We could rotate the arms around their axis, and then step back up our subdivision levels, and all that detail follows along. Let's say I want to move the head. I'll step down my subdivision levels and then mask up the neck. Invert that mask, and now I can easily rotate that head so it's looking up, or I can make it look down. Oops, missing a bit. Make sure I get that whole body masked. I can move that head down like this. That's actually quite nice. I like the look of that, with the head inclined down like that. Now step back up my subdivision levels, and all of my detail follows. So that's quite a powerful tool. Being able to move between your subdivisions levels this way is indispensable, in my opinion. And now if I decide I need to Dynamesh again, it's as simple as, let's delete our old high res there. It's as simple as going back to the geometry menu and then Dynameshing again. It's just in this case, if I've sculpted a lot of detail, I'll probably need to raise my Dynamesh resolution to capture my detail before I continue. So if I wanted to Dynamesh again, I would probably need to raise this value and then turn on Dynamesh. It's going to ask me if I want to freeze my subdivision levels. Say no. You see I lose detail. I'll just turn the slider up. Try it again. With the slider turned up, there you see it captures all of my detail. It has Dynameshed, but I have lost my subdivision levels. So Dynamesh is never going to let you keep your subdivision levels. Keep that in mind. But you can use this process to bounce back and forth between a subdivision model and a Dynamesh model. So before we move on, I want to show you what freezing the subdivision levels means. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And we'll open a simple model. In this case, let's just go ahead and use the one that we just made. I have a model here with multiple subdivisions. There's a snapshot there. I just snapshotted that to the canvas with Shift S. Step back up to my high res. Let's say I want to Dynamesh this again. I will come down here. I will turn on Dynamesh. And it says the mesh has multiple subdivision levels. Would you like to freeze subdivision levels before entering Dynamesh mode? I will say yes. So I say yes, and what it does is it freezes my subdivision levels. Now I Dynamesh. Alright, so now we have Dynameshed, so I can come in here and let's just say I wanted to use the snake hook brush to pull a spike off the shoulder. Execute that Dynamesh. There we go. Now, when I'm happy, I will turn off Dynamesh. Now what I want to do is I want to unfreeze my subdivision level. So I will now click Freeze to unfreeze them. And what it does is it tries to give me back my subdivision levels and project the new detail on. So it's kind of a more crude way of doing what we just did, doing our Z remesh and projection. you'll see once it's finished calculating that it will give us subdivision levels, but they won't actually be the same subdivision levels that we started with. And here we go. There you can see it has now given me 4 subdivision levels back. It's also baked in that Dynamesh that I did. And you'll notice the Dynamesh is now unmasked, so I can actually step down my subdivisions, do a bit of smoothing. So we'll step down to level 1, and there we go. So it's actually quite neat, but there are drawbacks. I feel like the technique that we showed first is better because it gives you a lower resolution, ordered mesh, as you can see on the left here, whereas this one gives you just a blanket Dynamesh level 1 mesh. So it's very, it has no order to it. It's just basically a carpet of evenly spaced quads. So I feel like we're better off simply bouncing back and forth using the projection method rather than freezing subdivision levels. But it is important to know what freeze subdivision levels does and what it means, especially because ZBrush is going to ask you every time you Dynamesh if you've got multiple subdivision levels, if you do want to freeze them. There have been times I have used freezing subdivision levels, but generally I find projecting and bouncing back from a Dynamesh with that initial process I showed to be far superior. So that concludes our look at Dynamesh. I hope that you've enjoyed this lesson. It's a very, very powerful tool, and I hope you look forward to going forward and using this in your own work.